Good morning, everybody. I'm Toy Hutchinson, President and CEO of the Marijuana Policy Project. And today we're holding this press conference for two purposes: to recognize the anniversary of the Shafer Commission report that was issued 50 years ago, and to share with you our report, MPP's report, which dovetails on the Shafer Commission report and explains where we are today in the decriminalization of cannabis. To all the press that are joining us, please put your questions, the outlet you're affiliated with, and who you're directing the questions to in the Q&A section of the webinar. We'll answer all the questions at the end. Also, if you have questions about the MPP report itself, Olivia Naugle is the author, and she's also here to respond. Our panelists in speaking order are Richard Bonney, Bernard Noble, Diane Goldstein, Ami Kachalia, and Dasheeda Dawson. And with that, we will get started. So I will turn it over to Professor Bonney.
Unmuted myself successfully, I hope. So
thank you so much for being here.
Yes, it's my pleasure to be here. Let me say, since I'm here to talk to you about the Shafer Commission report, I was Associate Director of the Shafer Commission. And so I'm going to transport myself in time back 50 years. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to do it, as you will see when I tell you what I have to tell you. So in 1970, Congress enacted the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, the main part of which was the Federal Controlled Substances Act that everybody, I'm sure, here is familiar with. The Controlled Substances Act was a modern regulatory statute for psychoactive drugs that displaced the then outdated Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 and the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. The 1970 Act also created the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, chaired by Governor Ray Shafer of Pennsylvania. He wasn't the governor then, I think. Former Governor Ray Shafer of Pennsylvania. And it was given a 2-year charge to issue a report on marijuana in the first year and on drug policy in general the following year. And obviously, I'm going to talk to you about the marijuana report, and I'm going to try to quickly address 4 questions. First, why was the Marijuana Commission needed? Second, what were its main findings? Third, what did the commission recommend? And what was the impact, fourthly, of the commission report? So why was the Marijuana Commission needed? Perhaps the best way to explain why the commission was needed is to look at the name of the commission's report, which maybe nobody here except me remembers. Marijuana, a signal of misunderstanding. Now, why did we give it that name? And I will give you 2 reasons. And obviously, you understand I'm oversimplifying a lot of history here in a short time. So take that with a little bit of a grain of salt on the exaggerations that may occur. So the first was that marijuana use signified a culture, the culture wars of the 1960s, and the hippie generation that challenged prevailing social norms about music and sex and other things, and became identified with intensifying dissent against the Vietnam War. So we were having a culture war. The society was significantly divided at that time. Smoking marijuana in that context was a symbol, I would put it, of generational misunderstanding. And that's one of the things that was inescapable about marijuana use at that time. The patterns of marijuana use had changed significantly as a result of what I described to you. The second reason, and perhaps more important for our purposes, was a widespread misunderstanding of the neuropsychological and behavioral effects of smoking marijuana. The drug was widely thought to be addictive, to cause aggression and violence, and to be a stepping stone to the use of more dangerous drugs, such as heroin. History shows that these myths also led to marijuana's legal classification in the legislation I described to you earlier and the state equivalents, the Uniform Narcotic Drug Act. I should have mentioned that was adopted by the states in the 1930s. and that those myths led to its classification as a narcotic drug. And so, in short, the commission was needed because the American people wanted to know the truth about marijuana use and were obviously uncertain, as members of the commission in some respects were until we started doing our work. So what were the commission's main findings? The commission reached two main conclusions about the effects of marijuana. First, it found that marijuana's effects were misunderstood, as I've indicated, and that its dangers had been exaggerated. The drug is not physically addictive, does not cause violence, quite the reverse, and in those respects, it's much safer than alcohol. Second, the commission emphasized that there was a lot we do not know about the effects of using marijuana. It particularly emphasized the need to research the consequences of chronic heavy use and the impact of marijuana use on adolescent development. And I mention those because those are still key priorities in the ongoing research on marijuana. So what did the commission recommend? The main recommendation, as you know, was that the country should decriminalize possession of marijuana for personal use and related behavior like casual transfers with other people. And we even had some discussion about cultivation for one's own use as well. And my view was that that was included in our recommendation also. The commission assumed that the nation would continue to discourage the use of marijuana, especially by youth, but it concluded that the cost of criminalization in criminalizing users far outweighed whatever public health benefits accrued from the criminal penalties. And clearly that remains so today. However, the commission also concluded that outright legalization of marijuana was not a plausible option, a policy option at that time. And it gave two main reasons, both of which remain pertinent today. First, we would need to learn a lot more about the likely public health consequences of widespread marijuana use. And second, and perhaps even more importantly, we would need to learn how to design a regulatory approach to this drug that would be able to contain adolescent use and to manage the public health consequences of the inevitably larger level, higher level of adult use. And in this regard, the commission observed that the two models then available, people used to talk about the alcohol model, that the two models then available, the alcohol model and the tobacco model, had both essentially been public health failures. And that was obviously significantly true, for tobacco. And the idea was we needed to learn how to do this properly, and you need to take your time on that. So finally, what was the impact of the commission's report? The usual account is that the Shafer Commission report was altogether ignored and that the Nixon administration declared a war on illegal drugs instead of paying any attention to what the commission had said. The story is a bit more complicated than that. President Nixon did tell Governor Shafer, who he cordially accepted the report, wasn't angry in any particular way and said that he would think about it. But he said that his immediate reaction was he didn't understand how possession could be legal if sale were still banned. And that was I think the initiation of thinking about decriminalization as an indication that it's not that you want to encourage something, it's just that you don't think that criminal sanctions is the best way to discourage it. And that was the essence, essentially, of the argument that we were making, which is, I think, what the contribution of the commission's report was. However, what is not remembered beyond Nixon's reaction is that the commission's decriminalization recommendation was well received because of its logic that I've outlined to you here, that you don't need to make something criminal just because you're trying to discourage the use of it. And it was well received by stakeholders, opinion makers, various professional organizations, ABA, AMA, et cetera, editorialists and various from both sides of the aisle, frankly, as well as policymakers. And it was eventually endorsed by the Ford White House and by the Carter administration. Most importantly, 11 states repealed criminal sanctions against marijuana between 1973 and 1978. Admittedly, and unfortunately, the reform effort did come to a screeching halt during the Reagan administration, when it was replaced by a policy of zero tolerance, as they called it, for all illegal drugs, including marijuana, and also accompanied by aggressive drug testing. So it was exactly the opposite of the approach that the commission had recommended, by basically using criminalization as a zero tolerance indicator for drug use, when our thought was all drugs are not the same, and we need to be more careful in thinking about explaining to people, why the use of them is discouraged, and the criminal sanction doesn't help. Then the crack epidemic in the early 1990s triggered a brutal drug war and led to repressive and racially biased drug sentencing and criminal justice policies, from which this nation has still not recovered. The pendulum on marijuana law reform finally reversed after this period that I've described to you during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, with the legalization of medical use in about half the states and some version of full legalization in about 1/3 of the states. Like most Americans, I have come to believe that legalization and careful regulation is a much more sensible approach to cannabis than prohibition, and it's time now to undertake these changes. The proper shape of marijuana regulation, however, is a challenge that was left unaddressed in the Shafer Commission report, and it needs concentrated attention today. We need to allow regulated access while protecting the public health. However, that is another conversation beyond what we are focusing on today. Our immediate priority is to finish the job of decriminalization, a sensible policy that was championed by the Shafer Commission 50 years ago, March 22nd, 1972. I do remember it well. And I also want to close by saying thanks to the Marijuana Policy Project for its longtime advocacy on behalf of decriminalization and for commemorating the Shafer Commission's role in achieving it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's really an honor to have you here. And it's striking to me listening to this, knowing that in May I'll be 49. So for my whole lifetime, the untold amounts of people who have lost their livelihoods all the way up to their lives because the crux of what the report said was handled the way it was. Literally the whole course of my life, I'm struck sitting here listening to you, but thank you so much for your time. And we are honored to commemorate this because, as we all know, 19 states today in 2022 still have not done the basic minimum of decriminalization. Right. So with that bit of history lesson, which we all really appreciate, I will move to Diane Goldstein.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with our longstanding collaborative partners throughout the years. Good morning, everyone. My name is Diane Goldstein. I'm a retired lieutenant with the Redondo Beach Police Department and the current executive director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, a nonprofit group of police, prosecutors, judges, and other criminal justice professionals who speak from firsthand experience. Our mission is to make communities safer by focusing law enforcement resources on the greatest threats to public safety and addressing the root causes of crime. I spent over 21 years policing a failed drug war that has never been a war on drugs, but a war on people. The Shafer report found that the potential harm of the use of cannabis is not great enough to justify intrusion by the criminal justice system into private behavior. It's sometimes tempting, despite the current administration, for U.S. drug policy reform advocates to imagine that the dramatic change in public attitudes of recent years is ubiquitous. That's a big mistake because so many of those who hold the power to inflict harm remain rooted in an antiquated drug war mentality. We must push back at law enforcement officials who still argue that increasing prosecutions will drive down drug use. Because while the drug warriors are losing ground on adult consumption and medical cannabis models, there are still 19 states, as well as the federal government, where an individual could land in jail for simple possession of cannabis. As advocates, we must continue fighting the stigmatization of those who use cannabis responsibly. We must prevent the ongoing and repeated attacks on those who recognize criminalization has failed and on those who work to ensure that prohibitionists and law enforcement no longer undermine initiatives proven to reduce harms, just as decriminalization has done. In Arkansas, possessing less than 4 ounces of cannabis is a misdemeanor that carries up to 1 year in jail and a fine of up to $2,500. 1 ounce of cannabis or more by those who've been convicted twice results in a felony that will land an individual in prison for up to 6 years and a fine of $6,000. This is an unconscionable injustice, but it's a reality that some of us still live in, particularly people of color who, despite similar rates of usage as white people, overwhelmingly shoulder the burden of enforcement. In those states that have reformed the laws to stop arresting and jailing individuals for simple cannabis possession, thousands have been saved from being tied up in the justice system. When police officers squander our finite resources on low-level cannabis enforcement, a chain reaction happens. Other more serious crimes remain unsolved. Survivors of crime become more reticent to come forward and report crimes. Public confidence in policing deteriorates as clearance rates either stagnate or decline, and public trust in policing as an institution begins to decline as well. Speaking from experience, we need the public to trust us in order to effectively do our jobs. People who don't trust us don't talk to us, and that goes both for survivors of crime and witnesses of crime. This means fewer crimes being reported and more crimes going unsolved. Our ability to solve crime and help people receive justice is seriously diminished. Contemporary research shows that prohibition offers limited, if any, deterrence, and many studies indicate that an emphasis on prosecution does not stop drug use, manufacturing, or sales. In 2018, more than 660,000 people were arrested for cannabis-related charges. Almost all of those arrests, both historically and in the present day, are for low-level possession, not drug lords, not kingpins. That's a tremendous burden on our courts and jails, which are already strained. All of that for something that is harming, not improving community safety. Our drug control strategy since the Shafer report was issued has resulted in the unwarranted deaths of law enforcement officers and the public were sworn to protect and serve in an attempt to achieve an ideological policy of being a drug-free America. What has occurred instead is corruption and a violation of American civil liberties, engendering disrespect both for the law and policing. I know, again, from my experience as a career professional police officer and as the current executive director of an organization that has for 20 years advocated for rational drug policy based on evidence, compassion, and a true respect for human rights. Law enforcement can simultaneously advocate for all those things while supporting justice. It's time to act. We need to decriminalize cannabis across the country and make peace with drugs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Goldstein. Okay, this is a lot of heady information, but it's also pretty accurate in historical context. So again, for all of our panelists that are here, I want to remind anyone who has questions, please put your questions, the organization you're affiliated with in the Q&A answer, and we'll take questions at the end of the report. And so now let's move to Ami Kachalia. Am I pronouncing that right? Wonderful. I practiced. I want to make sure it was right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you for having me. And good morning, everyone. I'm glad to join you on the anniversary of the Shafer Commission report. My name is Ami Kachalia, and I'm a campaign strategist at the ACLU of New Jersey. The war on drugs has resulted in tremendous harms to communities across the country for over 50 years, with marijuana criminalization often used as a pretext for police stops and arrests and as an entry point into the criminal legal system for far too many people. It has disproportionately harmed Black people, who are 3.64 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people nationally, despite similar rates of use. The harms of marijuana-related arrests are significant, not only because of the immediate impact of an arrest or conviction, but because of the many ways a prior arrest or conviction are used to meaningfully deny opportunities to individuals in a range of areas, including immigrants' rights, housing, and employment. For immigrant communities, marijuana-related convictions can result in devastating consequences for individuals and their families, leading to immigration detention, deportation, and family separation. As a result of both federal and state laws that criminalize marijuana, More than 45,000 people whose most serious conviction was marijuana possession have been deported since 2003, and marijuana offenses are consistently among the top 10 most serious convictions of people deported. We have seen this here in New Jersey, where I am, time and time again. In 2018, a New Jersey man who had a green card and his wife, a disabled veteran, were stopped by ICE after dropping their daughter off at daycare. Because of 3 prior marijuana possession charges, the most recent of which was already 4 years old, he was detained by ICE, separated from his wife and 4 children, and faced deportation. In another case, a young man who had lived in New Jersey since he was 4 years old had his deportation expedited as a result of a marijuana-related charge. And even now, because of the lack of decriminalization or legalization at the federal level, non-citizens in some states that have legalized and decriminalized cannabis can still face deportation for a prior marijuana-related charge, even when the state has expunged their record. Non-citizens may also be deemed inadmissible for admission to the United States, which means being denied a visa or lawful permanent resident status, and they may also be barred from naturalization as a result of a prior marijuana record, and because of criminalization and scheduling of marijuana at the federal level. In order to address this, we need both federal and state action. Nationally, all federal criminal and civil penalties for marijuana must be removed, and comprehensive marijuana reform that prioritizes people most harmed by prohibition is necessary. Federal policies that systematically deny people dignity, humanity, and access to opportunity, whether that's through immigration-related consequences or access to housing, must be removed. And there must be retroactivity in order to begin to repair the harms to millions of people who have already been harmed by marijuana criminalization. At the state level, we must remove all criminal and civil penalties in order to end the almost 550,000 marijuana arrests that take place annually across the country each year, and to ensure strong post-conviction relief. It's long past time that we end punitive marijuana policies and instead support drug policy that affirms the rights and dignity of all people and allows communities to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Ami. Okay, we are also joined by Dasheeda Dawson, who will be our next speaker. And I just want to remind people, you can go on ahead and put questions in the Q&A section of the webinar, and we will take them up at the end. Hello, Ms. Dawson. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Dasheeda Dawson. I'm the chair of the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition, as well as the Cannabis Program Manager for the City of Portland and Oregon, where I oversee the regulatory licensing, compliance, education, and equity initiatives for the city's program. I'm also a cannabis patient refugee that escaped fear of criminalization and unwanted police interactions for a more established West Coast experience and ultimately a healthier and happier existence. And this has led to my mission as a global cannabis advocate working across business, policy, and education to improve regulatory markets in the US and abroad. I want to thank Marijuana Policy Project and Toy Hutchison for leading this important call to action. Looking at my own history and the trauma endured growing up in pre-gentrified Brooklyn, although it helped shape me into the leader that I am today, I was devastated to learn that this existence was an intentional result of strategic initiatives on the part of the government, including Nixon's decision to ignore the Shafer Report published 50 years ago. Racially biased cannabis criminalization perpetuated recidivism in communities like my own, creating a prison pipeline in most hoods across America. We now have significant proof that the war on drugs was purposely designed as a war on people that, despite over 25 years of cannabis policy reform, still persists for millions across the country. Racism embedded in these policies disproportionately impacts Black, Indigenous, Latin, and immigrant communities, and the impact results in these same communities being the sickest, the poorest, and least protected from ongoing collateral damages of these poor cannabis policies. And so I stand today firm in calling for decriminalization. By that simply meaning to stop arresting people for cannabis possession. This policy reform is the first non-negotiable step in cannabis social equity, and the government must create and/or remove laws and policies that begin to undo the social, economic, environmental, and human injuries of prohibition. This is the required first step. And not only is it good for the people, it's actually good for the government too, because it's easy to implement with considerable cost savings as states spend billions of dollars collectively for arrests, legal proceedings, and incarceration. Looking at the 19 states without decriminalization policies highlighted in the MPP report, I want to call in Florida, Oklahoma, and Pennsylvania, leaders and advocates on the ground. These are jurisdictions that have already established healthy new state revenue with medical markets, that have literally launched multi-billion-dollar companies into the space while simultaneously spending resources to cage people, largely Black and brown people, for possession. Decriminalization is undoubtedly the government's accountability in cannabis policy reform, and it's the necessary first step to cannabis equity. We can't free the plant before we free the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really want to underscore when we're talking about these things, and this is something that I say anytime I'm talking about cannabis policy reform anywhere in the country. And that is, it's absolutely amazing that in 2022, we have a multi-billion-dollar industry and an entire ecosystem around it. And at the same time, we're still arresting almost 600,000 people a year for simple possession. Those two statements being true at the same time in the same country, this amount of time since that Shafer report was given, is just unconscionable. And that's part of the work of MPP as we continue to go into states and try to work on the most equitable cannabis reform policy laws that we possibly can, as we continue this march towards when federal legalization actually will be. The roadmap still is through the states. That's why this conversation is so incredibly important. And all the points raised by the panelists are just, again, in 2022, profound, that we even have to have a call like this on the 50th anniversary. So we do have a question in the chat, and it's for Mr. Bonney. 10 presidents so far have effectively ignored the commission's report recommending decriminalization. How many more administrations do you think it will take before the policy change is enacted? Do you feel like we're at a tipping point? That's from Kyle Yeager at Marijuana Moment.
Well, it's a hard question to answer because it's the federalism problem here. And it has just been shocking to me that Congress has not gotten its act together, for decades, when it's clear that something needs to be done about federal law. And of course, everything that's happening in the legalizing states is totally contrary to federal law. I mean, this is absurd. But we have a paralyzed federal government about this issue. And so it's hard for me to imagine. I drafted a bill for Barney Frank decades ago about basically taking, marijuana out of Schedule I and making it a scheduled drug, a different schedule, and then basically authorizing the states, doing it through statute instead of a constitutional amendment as we did with alcohol, but to then authorize the states to develop appropriate regulatory strategies. And my view was that you ought to keep the federal government in there to monitor what's going on. You would get the money that you needed basically to help implement it and have research and have criteria for enforcement questions and so on. Anyway, there's the vision, but we're nowhere near that, right? And talking about doing something, about this. So that's one side of it. And I think as we have been doing now for, a decade, you just basically have to ignore the federal government and say it's just going to stay there that way, but we're just not going to pay any attention to it. And the states, can continue to take the steps that they are taking to legalize the drug for, according to different strategies. And so my thought about that is that's we need to focus on what those strategies should look like. And maybe eventually we'll have an opportunity to get the federal government to jump back into this. But I'm not quite sure what else to do other than to continue on this very legally awkward path, that we are now on.
Definitely. As a former legislator, I can tell you it's supremely awkward. We're really talking about at its fundamental issue, a conflict of law. Like every time a state moves,
right, And it's a total
really
default.
cognitive law. It's something we're not,
No.
we're supposed to be able to harmonize over time. And it's getting harder and harder for each state that comes online to be able to do that. I wanted to throw out also to Ami and Dasheeda and Diane, do you think we're at a tipping point? How are you feeling about what it is you're seeing on the ground? And especially with the context of this situation now, where we're saying 19 states haven't decriminalized, but we also have 37 states with a medical marijuana program, and we also have 18 states with adult use. I know there were a lot of us that thought, when we hit 25, it's going to be good. Congress will act. They'll have to act. So how are you all feeling on the ground in the advocacy work that you all are doing about how the conversation of legalization, if it starts at decriminalization, how are you feeling about that? It's something that supremely worries me because people are still being impacted even in legal states.
I think the difficulty from my law enforcement perspective is that every state and even the federal government has a different meaning for what decriminalization looks like on the ground. So we don't even have a true understanding of what decriminalization should mean. So, I would, like, in my perfect world, and I think this is the issue that I always work with in regards to speaking to staffers and legislators, is what we do is we defelonize. And yes, we may decriminalize and there may be a civil fine for low-level offenses, but if you don't take care of that civil fine, there's warrants that are issued, you go to jail, you lose your driver's license. There's a whole significant amount of collateral consequences that occur even with decriminalization. So let's be clear that decriminalization is the necessary first step and we need to do it. But I would hope that we would have some type of standardized definition of what that would look like on the ground, so nobody has their driver's license suspended or ends up in jail in that fashion, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would piggyback and simply say that that's definitely something with the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition. We've been talking about the evolving language of cannabis equity. Actually, myself and Nina Parks were just at South by Southwest talking about this. And yes, for us as regulators, decriminalization is simply an undoing of law and policy that already exists to take away the crime. But to your point, we had a decriminalization law in the books in New York for my entire life, and yet I still have very clear scars from the war on people that it was, during the 80s and 90s. And so I would say that, our call for decriminalization is really to stop arresting people for a plant that we know is medicine, and that the U.S. government has participated in it. But I think being a local regulator has helped me learn more about how the local level and the state level can be so impactful to individuals and to communities in a much faster way, and we can bubble up those experiences. And so when we talk with Congress folks and around legalization, a lot of us are saying maybe we need more time at the state level to do this right, because to your point, we haven't even done decriminalization well.
Ami?
Thanks. And I just wanted to piggyback off what others had said. I think it's such a good point that decriminalization has looked differently in different places across the country. And I think something that's helped me as someone who's a state level advocate is New Jersey has benefited, right, from not being the first state that has decriminalized and legalized marijuana, and also not being the last, which is to say that we have been able to learn the lessons from other states that have gone before us. And I think that's one of the reasons why we went for an incredibly strong decriminalization model in New Jersey, where we decriminalized up to 6 ounces, where we thought about decriminalization not only as ending criminal penalties, but also making sure we were doing expungement, and also making sure that we had protections for young people, and wanting to find ways to decouple the ways in which drugs are used to impact people when it comes to housing and employment, and all of the other ways, right, that other people live their lives and have been systematically denied opportunities as a result of how drugs have been used to control people. And so when I think about decriminalization and what we can do, my only hope is that we go for the best possible version that we're seeing, and that as states continue to push for decriminalization, that we are only building and moving forward to make sure that decriminalization is more and more just. In terms of, to your question about whether or not there's a tipping point. You know, I'm not sure. I was with you when you said that we all thought at 25 states, like we'd have this moment where the majority of the country was living in places where, you know, cannabis was decriminalized or legalized, and that would be a strong incentive. All I can really say is that I hope it happens sooner rather than later, because the immigration consequences I talked about before, that's actually not something that we can fully address at the state level, which means that even as we flip the switch, even as cannabis becomes decriminalized or legal in places, that there are many people, a really large proportion of the population, who are non-citizens and who are unable to actually access it in the same kind of way, and who continue to face consequences when it comes to deportation, when it comes to being with their families, even when it comes to something as simple as being able to open or work in a marijuana business, because that can also impact someone's immigration related issues. And so there is a really strong need for federal action that is complementary and builds on all of the progress that we've made at the state level for the last few decades.
Yeah, that is, I think the thing that probably moves me the most, I'll never forget finally hearing that we had accomplished in Illinois, my home state, where I just spent almost 2.5 years as what they termed the cannabis czar in the state. And just the phone call, like it happened. 500,000 arrest records are now wiped. And we had started, you know, the decrim process in 2014, but the feeling, you know, that I had at that moment, or even listening to our state's attorney read the first 100 names of the first thousands that were going to be automatically expunged, and hearing the names, not knowing the people, but recognizing those names that come from communities that look like me. And a profound moment, especially since it's not the same in most of the states. And it's also part of the reason why the Marijuana Policy Project works the way we do, state by state, by state, by state, by state, because we want to try to figure out how to get this equitable policies in the hands of as many policymakers as we possibly can, because we're operating in 50 different jurisdictions and 50 different, and you can't even say 50 different ways, that's 50 states. There's untold numbers of counties and local municipalities and clerks' offices and police stations and all kinds of that are dealing with all kinds of disinvestment, including paper records, which is really, you know, we need funding for that to come into when you're going through this decriminalization process, because largely you can still lose your children. When you lose your job, because this is a custody matter at some points. This is like, not if you want to work in a cannabis industry, if you just want to be a barber or a phlebotomist or something else that, you know, has this thing in somewhere in a civil code where you can't because of a marijuana conviction, because of a cannabis conviction, and that we're still dealing with today. I saw Professor Bonnie had your hand up. Did you want to add to the conversation?
Well, I think you all have elaborated even, you know, more on what is a, you know, critical issue here. I was just going to, again, a historical note. I mean, that's part of what I can add to this. The commission recommendation was decriminalization with no sanction. And we rejected the idea of a civil fine, you know, because of just all the elaborated confusion that could cause and the other consequences. So we really meant it, and I think in the same ways that you all have talked about this, but it was a completely novel idea, you know, at the time. And so immediately the 4 congressional members, 2 senators and 2 members of the House of Representatives, who were in favor of our basic approach to this, which was wonderful. They were from both sides of the aisle. It was totally bipartisan. They were uncomfortable with it not being an offense at all, right, to get from where we were. So they, you know, they endorsed in a footnote, a civil fine, right? And of course, that's when you went to the legislatures thereafter, who, as I said, notwithstanding anything that Nixon ever said, we were in the right, you know, we were moving in the right direction. But the inclination of the states was to, you know, go with the civil fine. And then that leaves in place many of the issues that, you know, that y'all have been talking about. And so, and I can see it's gotten much more elaborate, and people are suffering the consequences in all the ways that you have said. And you're right, something needs to be done about that, right? Because there shouldn't be any debate about this part of the you know, of the story. So the final thing I'll say is, and I don't think Congress is going to help you, right? I mean, we have just got to continue to struggle along just the way with, you know, with alcohol and so on. It's going to have to be a state-related thing. Just Congress should get out of the way. It's basically, let's get Congress out of the way. And it would be nice if there could be some overarching monitoring that was going on. It would give you research money, for example, to find out what the effects actually are of what you're doing. But this idea of untangling criminalization and what it means, we did something at the time after the commission, because as I said, there was momentum in favor of what we recommended. We got the Uniform Law Commissioners to amend the Uniform Controlled Substances Act to decriminalize, marijuana, and they adopted it, right? And then when the pendulum swung the other way, and I was doing something completely different at that point, my cause was the death penalty, but they repealed it, right? It gotten so hot politically that they couldn't do it anymore, and they actually repealed it. Now, I have no idea, I haven't paid any attention to what they've been doing around this in recent years, but if y'all wanted at least to try to see whether there might be some model about how you decriminalize that could be, introduced into the Uniform Law Commissioners. It would take some time to do it. I'm not quite sure how much influence that it would have, but it might provide a chance to at least develop a model. So I don't know whether anybody among the reform community has actually thought about doing that. And I'm not sure it's worth the effort, either, but it was a thought. So those were my thoughts.
Thank you for that, Professor. We luckily have some amazing people on staff here at MPP who do incredible policy research and extend as much technical expertise as we can to as many policymakers as we can. One of the people I do want to highlight before we end this call is Olivia Naugle. She's on staff at MPP. She's an incredibly brilliant young writer and person that I'm so proud gets to work with us. And she's the author of our decriminalization report. And it's a very cool thing to see Olivia on my screen right under the box under Professor Bonnie. And the fact that this report was based on, what we learned from them and what's happened over the last 50 years. So Olivia, could you, and I know I'm throwing this at you right now, but you wrote this thing and I'm proud of you and we're all proud of you. So could you tell kind of what was the biggest thing that stood out to you on the working of this, you and all of our colleagues, as to what's happened over the last 50 years?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been awesome tuning into this right now. Thank you again to all the panelists for being here. I'm really excited about this rollout and this report. I think the biggest thing is, Toy had already highlighted on it, and I want to underscore it again because it's really kind of the thought process that went into, all the work and getting this report out, is that, we are now at a time where public support for cannabis legalization and decriminalization are at an all-time high. The legal industry is booming with billions of dollars in sales, yet there are still millions of Americans still living under the harsh policies of prohibition. So in this report, we really wanted to highlight these steep penalties, the racial disparities and arrests that still exist for cannabis possession. We wanted to give a human voice to the implications of these unjust policies. And we hope that in doing so, to again underscore the timely need for the remaining states to heed the findings of the Shafer Commission and to remove criminal penalties for cannabis possession. So I hope it can be a tool for advocates, for policymakers, just for general education around cannabis policy. So I did just want to give a final, plug to the report. Please check it out. Please share it. It'll be available at mpp.org/decrim report. And thank you all again so much for your time today and for lending your voices to the conversation.
Thank you, Liv. Okay, everybody, I think we've come to the end of a really wonderful discussion about a hard topic.
Toy,
yes, Denise.
we have one more question.
Oh, we do. I missed it.
For Toy, Amy, and Dasheeda, how can the general public who overwhelmingly support legalization demand decriminalization at the state and federal levels?
Okay, I could, one, call your legislators, both at the state and federal level. Educate yourself as to where the discrepancies and the disconnects lie. It's a fascinating thing because part of this is also the normalization of the conversation about cannabis in the first place. So even in your normal, regular, everyday circles, there's a lot of criminalizing language that comes into how we talk about this. There's a lot of, it's either on one side where it's a joke, or it's on the other side where you're talking about every stereotype, every myth that we've been trying to beat back for the last 30 to 40 years. So it's also changing your own language in your own space. Like we need to destigmatize, we need to make sure that people have access to lawfully regulated product in a safe manner without stigma and without criminal penalties. And that is one thing that needs to be said. Like get as comfortable talking about this as we do about alcohol. There's so many things that we can have a conversation. And part of that, even if you're not someone who consistently calls your legislators, or you're not someone that shows up in the Capitol, or you've never lobbied for anything in your whole life, part of it does start where you are, and you can bloom where you're planted, and you can change the way you talk about this to the people in your circles, and change happens like that. But definitely anybody in the space that has an opportunity to change something, any policymaker at the city, county, or state or federal level, make your voices heard. The most important job we have in a democracy is citizen, and that requires action. It requires action. So that's usually my 2-minute spiel about how you can do what it is you do, because there are a lot of advocates on the ground that have been everywhere across this country for decades and decades and decades, when not a single politician would listen at all. And they're still here, and we stand on their shoulders while we continue to do this work. If there's anything anybody else wanted to add to that? What can you do? What can people do? What can regular people do?
Use the report. I'm already like using it. Use the report. The report is very enlightening. And so even forwarding it, using it within your own circles, my own influential circles. I have lawyers and professors and the like within our sorority circles. I'm sharing the report because a lot of people didn't know about the Shafer report to begin with. And then a lot of people are also surprised at how many states still have such harsh penalties, even the ones who also have medical programs.
Right.
Yeah, and just adding to that, and really like highlighting what Toy said about like us being kind of standing on the shoulders of all of those who have come before us. There are so many people working on this. There's so many people who have been working on cannabis decriminalization and legalization for a long time. So my only other suggestion is find people you can organize with. All of us are really strong when we like call our lawmaker, go to the state capitol, lobby, organize. But we're so much stronger when we do it with other people. And so find your community and then go out there and make your demands.
It sounds wonderful. Thank you again to everybody. I think we've gotten through questions, and we can spend the rest of the day talking about how we're going to change the world. So for those of you who are watching this, you can reach this at mpp.org. That's the Marijuana Policy Project, mpp.org. You can reach our report, our 50th anniversary of the Shafer Commission report that was authored by us at that website. It's mpp.org. You said /decriminalization, right, Liv?
Yep.
/ So you can find the report there. You can share the report. And last, I'd just like to say you could join us. This is a mission, and we're going to keep going through state by state by state. So think about joining the mission, and we're ready and waiting for you to come see what we're doing, listen to what we're doing, follow what we're doing, and support the work that we're doing in all these states across the country. So again, I'm Toy Hutchinson, President and CEO of the Marijuana Policy Project. I want to thank everybody for being a part of this national press conference. And again, not only thank you for your work, but we're going to thank each other in advance for the work we have yet to do, because there's still so many lives to change on comprehensive cannabis reform policy that has to start with decriminalization. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you all for watching. And you can see this a little bit later at mpp.org. Take care, everyone.